Good morning, everyone. Most of you will know I'm G, one of the directors at DESI, and the session today is around optimizing data quality. The idea really is to walk through the process of moving from where you are at the moment, where you're likely want to increase the quality of your data to the point where you are not only cleansing your data as a starting point, but also improving and maintaining it and sustaining that data quality going forward. So this is based on our experience, some of the projects we've done specifically around this. So first question is always why is data quality important? And the most important thing really is around decision making. Poor data usually leads to poor decisions being made. Good data allows you to make effective decisions, things that are likely to go right. Once you've obviously made changes, made decisions, implemented something, done something. Obviously, from there on, we're starting to look at improvement. Good quality data is going to help you identify where change is required in the future. Um, and also whether those changes, any changes you make, have had the impact that you intended to have. We, as an improvement consultancy firm or transformation consultancy firm, we come across lots and lots of change activity that hasn't turned into anything in terms of improvement. It's often not even measured. So really, really important to have good quality data to show you whether you've hit your intentions, whether you've hit your objectives. And of course, good quality data is really important, and I think over the last few years, massively more important to meet regulatory and legal standards as well across the organisation. Most organisations are very sensitive around data, the data they collect, the data they keep, the data they present. Particularly in sort of housing, one of the big sectors that we work in over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a real push on having a certain standard, a sector standard, if you will, of information available, and that being of high quality. So those are the sort of key reasons. I'm sure there are others as to why data quality is important. So what's the journey? So what's the journey to get from where you are at the moment to a point where you have data quality? I like to think of it as, how do we get to the point where we are meeting standards and moving from what is often a data rich place, so we've got lots and lots of data, lots and lots of information, to a point where we have intelligence, that we can actually do something with the data that we've got. I mean, data quality is important. Doing something with the data is even more important. And what we tend to find from our experience is people do things if they've got high quality information that's informing them to do something. So it's really key. So what is the journey? So as with a lot of things that we do, the first stage for us is to diagnose the current state. And what we mean by that is understanding what exists at the moment, what data sets we have, what data flows we have. So we often talk about processes. Well, processes, a supplement of processes is data. So often during processes, new data is added, some data is updated. So it's understanding what that looks like. So once you have your data set, although at this stage you probably don't need the absolute detail, what we do want to understand is at what point where is this data coming from? Where is it being updated? Is it something that goes in and doesn't change? Is it something that's updated regularly? Maybe even who has access to it, who's able to change it. So that sort of understanding of how that data flows through your processes. Obviously, we understand the issues you have. Is it duplicated? Is it often out of date? Is it put in lots of different places? How do we know which one's the one true source and which one's accurate? We obviously want to understand potential risks. So, is there the risk of a data breach? Are we showing people information that they shouldn't be seeing? Or the other way around, are we not showing people information that's vital for them to do their job and it's really difficult for them to get that information? So understanding that's really important as well. And the thing that we often forget is, how is data managed overall? So again, it's a bit like processes. We get stuck with process improvement, but what we don't think about is how processes in general are managed. So when we want to change a process, what happens? It's the same with data. when people want to change a set of data or what we collect, or they want to stop collecting something, what is the process of doing that? How is data in itself, the data sets, how are they managed, who's responsible, who's accountable for the different sets of data? And what you'll tend to find at this stage is we've got duplicate data sets, information all over the place, poor management of data. That's generally what we get. Lots and lots of information, lack of clarity of who's using what data across the organization and between teams. So that's quite normal. Next step, once we have that, obviously you've got the diagnostic information that tells you what needs to change and what we need to improve. The first thing we really want to do is establish what I tend to refer to as your minimum data set. So what's the minimum we need? What do we need in order to be operational, to allow us to do the work that we want to do? What do we need in terms of our legal obligations, our regulatory obligations, our compliance elements being met? Do we need to refer to some sector standards? Is there something that we have to have in terms of our data? So that sets kind of as it sounds really, the minimum. We should have this data for us to function. This is the data we need. For us, the next one builds on that, and it's really what intelligence do we need. So it's asking first, what do we want to draw from our information? So what's going to help us make our decisions, or better decisions? What's going to help us take advantage of opportunities that come up, or innovate, or improve? So, and then we can sort of work back from that and say, well, if this is the intelligence we need, what sort of data does that mean that we need to collect or create through analysis? So there's two things here. You've got your minimum data set and your desired data set, and the last two boxes. Once we have that all together, we've in essence established what we need in terms of data. We need to start thinking about the data flows. So going back to that mapping exercise, this usually goes hand in hand with some form of process improvement, not always. This is about mapping how that data moves, often through systems, but it's not always systems. We might be thinking about where it's stored. We want to think about where it's being entered, who's entering it, where it's updated, and what instances would it be updated. If it is changed, who it is that's doing that. All of those sorts of questions. One of the really important ones, particularly in this day and age, is how many different systems it's going to. So if we collect one set of data and it goes off in 5 different places, how do we make sure that if it is changed, it's changed in all 5 places, not just the one place? So that's why mapping data flows, while laborious as an exercise, really, really important, because this takes it from just being a data item, just a sort of a known thing that we collect, into something more practical and usable. This is something, this bit is really saying how we're using our data, how we're working with our data. So really, really important to map those flows. And then before we can really get into it, in terms of building our future state, if you will, is the thing that people often forget, which is setting the standards, the governance framework around how we want data to work in the future. If you fail to do this, which lots of organizations do, what you tend to do is you end up doing the first 4 things every 4 or 5 years. You end up, cleansing your data. You have the same issues every 4 or 5 years, because it degrades. Your data sets degrade, the flows degrade. So setting the standards is really important. So we're asking ourselves, how will it be maintained? Who is it that's going to take the accountability and responsibility for different elements? Who owns each data set? Who's responsible signing off if we're going to stop collecting data, or if we want to add a new data set? And again, it's one of the failings in lots of organizations in their current state is they add more and more data collection in, but they don't do the data flows. They don't think about, well, where is that going to be collected? And often they'll find different teams are collecting the same information, but in different ways. So one of them is usually right, the other one's kind of right, and you've lost your quality there again. So that's where, setting the standards, setting the framework of how data is, how we're going to govern data, is really key as well. It doesn't have to be, litigious. It doesn't have to be lots and lots of forms and stuff like that. We want to keep it simple, but we want to make it effective. Yeah. So there are your stages, which means obviously once we've done those stages, we're there. Well, we're kind of there. It's not time to celebrate at the moment. What we've done is the legwork. The next stage, not necessarily in a particular order, but this order tends to work, is we need to cleanse the data. So this is taking your current state and starting to remove or archive or add the data that we've said is our minimum data set and our intelligence. So this is really about cleaning. It's about getting rid of the stuff that we don't need so we can, rather than being really data rich, what we're starting to think about is being really focused with the information data that we keep. Next stage is to embed those standards. So what does that mean? Do we embed things into the system? So it might be things like access, who has access to what, how people change things, the operational standards, building it into the processes. It might mean, and that management, that sort of framework around who owns it, how it changes, who's responsible for signing off those changes as well. So really key to embed those standards. We feel doing that early doors is really important, and it usually falls on the head, sort of senior staff to be accountable for data sets large at that high level. So I might be responsible for the finance data set, for example, as a director of finance. What does that mean for positions below that? So are we delegating responsibility for updating information or archiving information, whatever it might be? Next, the hard work, and this is where the real hard work is creating those data flows. And where possible, as I said before, we want to link that to process improvement, because when you're mapping processes, naturally you'll be mapping data flows as well. And what you'll find is when you start to do data flows, and you're creating a new way of, a new data flow, you'll find that your processes aren't quite up to standard. They're not fit for purpose. So at the moment, your processes aren't good enough for you to collect data in a consistent, reliable, accurate way, which is why you tend to want to try and do those things together. And this is why it takes so long, really, to get those data flows in place. Okay. Obviously, at this stage, we're starting to think about systems as well, where it's kept, where it's stored, how people have access to it as well. So yeah, so that's our experience. There are thoughts. If I come out of that, um, like everything that we pretty much we do, so not particularly complex, quite a simple approach to do these things. They're very, very difficult, very, very time consuming, in order to do it, but well worth doing it on the basis that once you've done it and you do it right, like most things in life, I suppose, if you do it right the first time, the maintenance of it becomes very easy, and it lasts for a very long time. Whereas what tends to happen if you do it wrong is you come back again and again and again. You have to keep investing lots and lots of time to get that data quality back up. So yeah, hope that was helpful. I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, I would be using this, the learning from this in the context of my role staff networking group.
Okay.
Um, we're in the process of coming coming together to formulate questions for a survey on SurveyMonkey
Mhm.
for uh, a subgroup of the group sounding board is to voice concerns. Basically, it's BAME within power,
Yeah.
and the sounding board is if you have to sort of whistle blow or alert Sandra, for instance, in safeguarding about issues either in your advocacy work or not personally with among yourselves with your other colleagues in the
Yeah.
office. So going to be asking some questions and sending out to the entire staff email to find out whether the still whether the function is still relevant and questions along those lines. Basically, it would be good to know how to mine that information. Get it?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, so I mean that's probably something I didn't touch on. I talked about operational info and minimum data sets, and if you go into the intelligence part of it, the third box, what we tend to find in there is that data goes in one of two ways. It either turns into operational data, so it's an analysis or information that we continue then to collect going forward, and it just becomes part of the minimum data set. Or it can be a little bit what this sounds like, what we call sort of transitional data.
Yeah.
So we need it right now, but it's not going to be particularly useful again in the future. Or if it is, we might collect it again as a single instance. So I suppose the collation of it, the analysis of it, and the use of it is more important than the storage of it necessarily, because we
Yes.
know we're only going to use it for that one time. Yeah,
Yes. Exactly. That's the
yeah,
case here.
yeah. Which is fine, I think, and that's the point. I think data, I said before. I mean, data, it's only important when it has a clear purpose. So if that clear purpose is to drive a change or drive some improvement, whether that means introducing new things or getting rid of old things. Once you've done that, you become more interested in whether the impact has been had, those sort of performance type data, as opposed to what data you had. An example might be when we do a service review, we pull together quite detailed maps, value stream maps. I'm sure some of the practitioners that might listen to this have been part of that. That has a lot of data on it. But once we have done that and we have redesigned and created a new map, we don't keep the old map. It goes. We don't need it anymore. So while it's important, I think it's important to recognise where data is transitional. We just need it for now. We don't need to keep having it. We don't need to store it. We don't. What we need to store is what we got from it, the understanding, the findings, the sort of
Mm,
what we acknowledge from it. So yeah, which is it sounds like what you're doing, which is
exactly.
yeah. Once you've got it, once you've analysed it, what we've found is really important. We want to store that as information, but everything else kind of we don't really need it anymore.
Yeah. I agree.
But yeah, I think you do right in I know you're working with some guys as well, but yeah, I mean the first question about data is always what do we need and why do we need it.
Mm,
Really important to ask. So when you do those two boxes around data sets and minimum data set and intelligence, you should always be asking what's the point? What's the point of having this data? What's the point of having this data? Um, and explore that and give that time. I think people too easily at the moment. I've had experience of people doing this and just saying, "Oh, well, the sector collect this, so we'll just collect this. That's what someone else has said we should collect." No one
mm,
really says, "But they're really poor at it," So
yeah.
I would always challenge that. It's a good starting point sometimes, but yeah, it's worth questioning. Good. Any other questions at all? Difficult when you're on your
That's
own.
yeah. That's the most current thing I can think of. I obviously use it generally for work as an advocate to keep monitoring people's like equal ops information. So I don't mind that information. I'm not sure who does. I know that the manager, the community manager, would monitor that, but it's initially put on the system by a help hub, and they're not always that proficient at keeping track of that information. So sometimes when I finally do speak to clients and I gather that sometimes it's quite different to what they have put on. And I guess also like mining through the find like some of the information that we write in our records. But again, I'm not responsible for that, so I'm not quite sure how that's.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point that you raised. because I think one of the other things around data, and particularly when we start thinking about, I think I said, often data might be collected in one place, but it's used by lots of other places. And people forget that, and they don't think too much about the data they're collecting. Lots of the process sort of improvement work we do, we find that one part of a process can't operate as it wants to or it should do because another part before it hasn't done what they expected, or they haven't collected the right information, or they've
Mm-hmm.
not entered it fully, and it screws up the process. So I think part of that data flow exercise part is about knowing and understanding the end to end for data, so where it's being entered, who's responsible for it, and understanding that as a collective, as an organization. um, and going back to that sort of minimum data set work and the intelligence work, it's not just knowing what it is we want to collect, it's also how we want to collect it, so and how it's going to be presented. So that I remember some of the work I did with one client, sort of 10 columns. It was like, what is the data item? So what's the sort of data? Why are we collecting it? Who collects it? What format does it take? Simple things like addresses. Should it be ROAD, or should it be or is RD okay for road? What's the expectation for the, and what's what's the standard
Mm.
for each of those data items is a really important exercise, because like I said, people use that information, and the more free text you become, the more
Yes.
intelligence led you come, and the more depth you try and get in terms of information, the harder that is.
Yeah. Because
So
I think, sorry, I think to myself that for me personally, I have a fear of discarding information just in case in a few months' time I want to retrieve it. And
you
I
need
can't.
it.
Exactly. So I don't know how I overcome that so that I can just park it and
Yeah,
make do with what I have.
yeah. Well, it happens. I think there's always a space for more and new data. I often say measuring something makes you want to measure something else, and means new data. And that's where I think that governance side comes in. So it's not a restrictive thing. It's not to add restriction in. It's to add reliability and standards in. So um, when you create data flows, and you embark on that, how we're going to manage data, you need to build in, how do we, if we want more data, if we want new things, how do we go about doing that? But more important, how do we go about doing that and doing it well? So rather than saying we're stuck with this one bit of data and that's all we have, we'll go into organizations and say, can we have this, can we have that, can we have this? We don't collect that. Right, okay, well, let's start collecting it. And it's, sometimes we say, well, the data flow has to be manual. We're just going to have to collect it manually. And then we'll transpose it, and then we'll maybe keep that, and the sort of electronic version. But yeah, it's a difficult one. We do tend to go in a just in case sort of mind frame. I'll
Exactly.
keep it just in case.
Yeah, just to
Um,
protect yourself. That's
yeah, yeah. But the risk is obviously it becomes outdated. You then rely on something that's not quite accurate. We're looking at data from a year ago, and you think, well, actually, does that, is it the same thing? And I think that's, old data affects decision making just as much as poor data does. So,
all.
I think I just need to be clear as to what point do we say that that data is not useful anymore? And if it's not useful anymore, what do we do with it? Do we archive it? Do we just
Mm.
delete it? I think again, as part of the standards in exploring each sort of data item. Good stuff, right? Conscious of the time, so it is 10:30. Unless you've got any questions, happy
I'm
to.
okay. Thank
No,
you.
good stuff. No,
I've
thank you.
I've enjoyed it. It's been useful.